Here in the UK, the mood music isn't great at the moment. The government is incredibly unpopular. Public services are struggling, doctors are striking, taxes are rising, and major infrastructure projects like HS2 are persistently over budget and behind schedule. Unsurprisingly, the headlines are constantly negative, and there's a pretty widespread sense among ordinary Brits that the country is headed downhill. However, zoom out a bit and it quickly becomes clear that, for all its problems, there are actually quite a few reasons to be optimistic about the UK's future. So, in this video, we're going to explain why, unpopular as this take might be, the UK might actually be doing better than you might think. The next issue of our magazine, Too Long, is coming out soon, with this issue focusing on realignment in the Middle East, discussing how recent events fundamentally reshape the region. Pre-order your copy or subscribe by clicking the link in the description. Now, before you have a go at us in the comments, we should make it clear, we're not saying everything's rosy, and it would be silly to deny the UK has lots of problems. Rather, we're just trying to say that things aren't necessarily as bad as they're sometimes made out to be. And, as we see it, there are three areas for optimism in the UK at the moment: the economy, education, and politics. Let's start with the economy. There's a pretty broad consensus at the moment that the UK economy isn't doing great. Houses are appallingly expensive, growth is sluggish, inflation is still high, and the public finances clearly aren't in good nick. However, it's important to recognise that things could definitely be worse. For starters, the UK was actually the fastest growing economy in the G7 for the first half of this year. And while growth has slowed somewhat since, both the IMF and the OECD forecast that the UK will be the second fastest growing economy in the G7 in 2025, behind only the US, and roughly on a par once you strip out AI-related spending on data centres, which are currently adding something like 0.5% to America's GDP. Furthermore, while our public finances aren't in great nick, it's important not to overdo it. Borrowing costs may be high relative to what they were in the 2010s, but compared to what they used to be, they're actually really not that high at all. Similarly, while it's technically true that the tax burden has risen to a recent high, that's mainly for demographic reasons, which is why most developed countries have seen their tax burdens rise. Moreover, hard as it might be to believe, the UK actually has pretty low taxes by international standards. The UK's total tax intake in 2021, for instance, the most recent year for which there's internationally comparable data, was just 33.5% of GDP, the third lowest in the G7 and below both the G7 and OECD averages of 36.3% and 34.1% respectively. Similarly, according to the latest OECD data from 2024, the UK had the lowest so-called tax wedge on an average worker in the G7 at 29%. Compared to 30% in the US, 47% in France and Italy, and 48% in Germany. Admittedly, these numbers don't include the increase in employers' national insurance contributions that happened at the last budget. But even when you factor that in, the UK only rises to about 32%, a smidge above the US, but well below Italy, France, and Germany. The point we're trying to make here is that the UK's public finances are squeezed, sure, but unlike, say, France, the UK still has a lot more room to tax. Furthermore, there are at least three reasons to be optimistic about the future. First, the UK relies far less on manufacturing than most other countries, and more on services, like finance, law, and consulting. It's rarely mentioned, but the UK is actually pretty great at services. It's the second largest service exporter in the world after only the US, with services exports roughly doubling between 2016 and 2025, overtaking goods exports. This means the UK is far better placed to cope with the coming era of protectionism than other countries. Take Germany, for instance, which relies far more on goods than services. Tariffs and other protectionist policies implemented by countries like the US and China have made it far harder for German manufacturers to export to other markets and compete with their subsidised competitors in the US and China. The UK is less affected because, well, these protectionist barriers only affect goods, not services. This is why UK-US trade has held up relatively well. The UK exported £59 billion of goods to the US in 2024, but exported more than twice as much, £137 billion in services, which weren't affected by Trump's tariffs. Second, the UK is actually a remarkably entrepreneurial and innovative economy. Take the Global Innovation Index, for instance, which uses 80 metrics to rank countries on their levels of innovation. These are split into innovation inputs, such as R&D, education expenditure, and number of STEM graduates, and innovation outputs, such as patents, high-tech exports, and finance available to startups. Overall, the UK ranks as 6th globally in the index, putting it ahead of China, France, and Germany. On inputs specifically, the UK ranks 10th, and on outputs it ranks 3rd, which suggests that the UK is getting quite a lot of value from its innovation investment. The UK comes behind only the US, China, and India when it comes to the number of unicorn companies it has, companies valued at $1 billion or more, and punches above its weight in a number of high-tech industries, including AI, quantum technology, and pharma. Quite a lot of this is down to the UK's innovation clusters, like London, Cambridge, Oxford, and Manchester, areas where academia, business, and investment all work together to produce new technologies and, ultimately, economic growth. The government has recognised the value of these clusters and recently announced a plan to try and better connect Oxford and Cambridge through the creation of more homes and better transport links, with the hope that it becomes Europe's Silicon Valley. Third, the UK has a lot of what we might call catch-up potential. One of the root causes of the UK's economic woes, for instance, is its weak investment levels. Higher investment typically means businesses find innovative ways to improve productivity, which in turn helps to improve economic output. In the 1980s, investment accounted for about 23% of UK GDP. From the 2000s onwards, this had fallen to around 17% and has not recovered. This hasn't been the case in France and Germany, where investment has remained between 20 and 25%. The original decline in the 90s was probably something to do with the UK's transition away from manufacturing towards a service-based economy, but the prolonged stagnation in the 2000s was at least partly caused by austerity, and the slump in the 2010s and 20s was at least partly caused by Brexit and the ensuing uncertainty. This has been terrible for the UK's productivity. While the UK enjoyed relatively similar productivity to France and Germany in the early 2000s, the UK has since fallen behind, with the gap between the UK and France and Germany tripling between 2007 and 2019. But this all comes with a substantial silver lining. Austerity and Brexit are finally over, which means investment levels should start rising again. In fact, this year we've already seen a 3.7% boost in private sector investment, and public sector investment is set to reach almost £140 billion by 2027, almost twice what it was back in 2008. If the UK is able to get back on track and increase its productivity to the levels of France and Germany, this will provide an extra £100 billion per year for the Treasury, or around £8,000 per household. The silver lining we're trying to articulate here is that a massive increase in living standards wouldn't require a completely unrealistic transformation of the economy. Rather, it just requires us to become a more normal country in terms of investment and productivity. Anyway, you get the point. The UK economy isn't doing as bad as it's sometimes made out, and there is cause for optimism going forward. So, let's move on to the second area where the UK might be doing better than you think: education. Again, this is just something the UK does very well. The UK has 4 of the top 10 universities in the world, according to the QS World University Rankings for this year. This is particularly beneficial for 2 reasons. First, it's good for the economy. Foreign students pay more to study here in the first place, and at least some of them go on to start businesses in the UK and help grow the economy. But second, it also provides the UK with a significant amount of soft power. Having some of the world's most prestigious universities means that we attract and educate people who go on to be incredibly influential. For instance, the UK has educated 50 world leaders who were in post in 2022, more national leaders than any other country in the world. But it's not just universities. British schools are also pretty great. Now, this wasn't always the case. In the 2009 Programme for International Student Assessment, or PISA scores, British secondary school students ranked 28th in the world in maths, 25th in reading, and 16th in science. And in 2010, a mere 68% of British schools were rated as either good or outstanding by school inspectors. By 2022, however, the latest year for which PISA data is available, British students had risen to 12th in maths, 14th in science, and 13th in reading in the PISA rankings, the best results for any large European country apart from Poland. A year later, 88% of schools were ranked as either good or outstanding. Behind this improvement was the Conservative Schools Plan, which was implemented by Schools Minister Nick Gibb. In many ways, this is a demonstration of what government can do when it comes up with a plan and actually sticks to it. Gibb remained Schools Minister under 4 out of the 5 Tory Prime Ministers between 2010 and 2024. So, moving to our last reason to be optimistic: politics. Now, while this isn't something people tend to be that optimistic about here, there's at least one reason they should be, and that's the UK's first-past-the-post electoral system. Until recently, the UK's majoritarian system looked markedly inferior to Europe's more representative electoral systems, which gave voters a real choice and apparently bred a more convivial coalition sort of politics. Today, however, the risks of proportional representation have become glaringly apparent. With the rise of radical parties on either side of the political aisle, many European countries are struggling to form viable coalitions, leading to constant political dysfunction and endless snap elections. Again, we're not at all saying that first-past-the-post is perfect, but it's at least true that representative systems no longer look quite as attractive. More generally, the UK has somehow preserved its international standing. It's still one of the 5 nuclear-armed states with a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, a member of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, and seems to be successfully maintaining its various international alliances. Starmer was the first world leader to secure a deal with Trump to mitigate the effects of his tariffs, and despite all the talk of having to choose between Europe and the US, the UK has been praised by the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz as being in the inner circle of those who lead. All in all then, while Britain has its fair share of problems, in many areas it performs significantly better than other comparable countries, and its strengths are often overlooked. Now, when a news story outlining some of the difficulties the UK faces does break, the headlines aren't just fast, they're fragmented. But if we take a look right now at this story about the meagre 0.1% growth rate in the UK in the last quarter using Ground News, we can see that there are 80 sources currently reporting on it, with most of the coverage coming from the centre. If we dive a bit deeper, we can see that the left is framing it as yet another blow to the government's authority, and the right focuses more on the economic consequences. We're able to get such a detailed analysis thanks to our sponsor this week, Ground News. If you're overwhelmed by the amount of outlets and stories that you're seeing online, Ground News has the solution for you, as they expertly collect and merge thousands of articles into one easy-to-access place, finally giving you an effortless way to consume news and digest media bias. And it doesn't even end there. Ground News offers you comprehensive breakdowns into the ownership, bias distribution, and factuality of each article, allowing you to dive even deeper into every story. For example, if you're worried about how much you can trust what's being said about a certain event, with a click of a button, you can filter and sort every story by their factuality level, helping you to easily grasp the reliability of each outlet. It's not just the stories we see that shape the narrative, it's the ones we don't. Ground News' blind spot feed is the only feature that shows stories being ignored by one side of the political spectrum, helping you break out of your bubble and spot what you might have missed. To give you an idea, here we can see that this story on Prince Andrew hiding from the US House of Representatives Epstein inquiry would have been completely buried if you lean right, as it's only being reported by left-leaning outlets. Ground News doesn't just feed you stories based on your algorithm, it allows you to see everything the other side might not want you to. That's why we're partnering with them to offer you 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. All you have to do is subscribe through the link in the description, go to ground.news/TLTR or scan the QR code on screen, and you'll be supporting an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.